I can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
Whatever it is, to try and channel it for
You
good.
will see a procession of
deny what I think is false, argue what I think is false, you have to have free and uncorrupted communication.
And it's a special pleasure for me to be able to introduce the keynote speaker today. I've known Gayatri Spivak for a number of years and seen her lecture in many different venues over the years, and this is actually an event that I would have come to even if I hadn't been asked to give the introduction. As you know, Professor Spivak is the Avalon Foundation Professor in the Humanities at Columbia University, and also the director of the Center for Comparative Literature and Society. She's had a remarkably influential career for more than 25 years. She's taught at the University of Iowa, University of Texas, University of Pittsburgh, Emory University, and she's held visiting professorships, often distinguished visiting professorships at many places, including Brown, Riyadh, the Université Paul Valéry in France, Stanford, and most recently at University of California, Irvine. She has honorary degrees from the University of Toronto and the University of London, and really more fellowships and honors than I have time to mention today. In thinking about the range and the reach of Professor Spivak's teaching and her writing, I'm reminded of the adjective that Homer used to describe Odysseus, polytropos. Gayatri Spivak is a woman of many ways, a woman of many turns, dare I say a woman of many tricks, a woman of many tropes. Professor Spivak's first book, indeed, was called Myself Must I Remake? The subtitle, The Life and Poetry of W.B. Yeats, was published in 1974. And this was followed soon after, in 1976, by Of Grammatology, her widely read and influential translation of Derrida's De la Grammatologie. And I still remember, I was a graduate student at the time, the impact that that translation and critical introduction had, even among those who were reading Derrida in French. It was must reading, even if you had already read it in French. And by the way, Professor Spivak is a very distinguished literary translator as well. In the years that followed, she would take her deep investment in language and in translation in the broadest sense and translate the deconstructive turn into the cultural turn with a series of important and, again, influential works, the very titles of which indicate the scope and the focus of her critical analysis. To name a few of the major ones: In Other Worlds, Essays in Cultural Politics, Thinking Academic Freedom, Engendered Postcoloniality, Outside in the Teaching Machine, A Critique of Postcolonial Reason, Towards a History of the Vanishing Present, and Death of a Discipline, a very interesting work about the future of comparative literature. Spivak has helped to shape the discourse and contours of postcolonial studies, cultural studies, feminist theory, and literary theory, always resisting facile categories, always seeking to overturn both conventional wisdom and trendy cliches, always trying to translate between and among language, culture, gender, and politics. In 1985, Professor Spivak published an article called Can the Subaltern Speak? Speculations on Widow Sacrifice. And this article has been seen as a foundational and also a groundbreaking intervention in subaltern studies, having a transformative impact on this field, and indeed on much work in the humanities and social sciences. Well, today we're fortunate to have Professor Spivak look back and look forward and return with a keynote address entitled The Trajectory of the Subaltern in My Work. The twists and turns and returns of this trajectory no doubt intersect and parallel in interesting ways the intellectual trajectories of many of us in this room. So it is with great interest and indeed anticipation that I introduce Professor Gayatri Spivak, Polytropos.
Polytropos, that used to be also translated as much lying. You remember that? So, well, you know, I do literature. It's okay. Fiction for me is not derived, so that's fine. I'm a little embarrassed, actually, about the title of the talk, and I'll tell you what it was. The Rethinking Marxism group, actually, in their kindness, said to me, and you know, I've been hanging around with them for many years, since the beginning. They said to me last year, Gayatri, come on and talk to us a little bit about how you have rethought Marxism through the subaltern. I don't think I have really rethought anything through anything, but since they asked me that, it was appropriate to call the talk, you know, rethink this trajectory of the subaltern in my work. And so I said to Shati that I had this talk, and then lo and behold, the poster came, and I realized that in her infinite kindness, she had actually asked me to give a keynote address. I'm not, and it was called that thing, so do forgive me, it's a very sort of narcissistic kind of title, but I'm really not able to give a keynote in this crowd, especially since you know, some of the real stalwarts of subaltern studies, alphabetically, Gautam Bhadra, Shel Mayaram, Gyanendra Pandey are present in the audience. I hope you will treat me with indulgence. On the other hand, I also thought that perhaps I should at this point say something about my trajectory disguised under some more humble title, because indeed my name is a peculiar thing in the history of subaltern studies. Some completely ignore me, and I'm happy with that. You know what I mean? People like Ijaz Ahmed, people like my friend Nick Dirks, who gives the authorship of post-colonial stuff in his most recent book to his dissertation director, Edward Said and Ranajit Guha. Fine. Stanley Kurtz at the other end of the spectrum. Some people ignore me in this way, and I'm cool with that. I think that's fine. But then comes another thing, and I'm talking about published prose. I'm not aggrandizing myself. I've read this a million times. Well, million, you know, hyperbole, Polytropos. But in the Economic and Political Weekly, Spivak would not recognize a subaltern if she saw one. Righto. And then, you know, this, I could go on, but that would be a boring talk. So there's a lot of this stuff, and then there is this peculiar idea, again, published prose, that contact with Gayatri Spivak ruined the subalternists by taking them from real history to America. I think it's an insult to both them, to subaltern studies, and to me. All roads lead to Rome. They would have come to America anyway. They didn't need me. So in a sense, now this is something that I have been hearing, so I thought, hey, why not say something about and in fact, even in your very generous introduction, I don't believe Can the Subaltern Speak had so much of an influence on subaltern studies at all. But it did have all kinds of influence here and there, but Partha Chatterjee has been very kind recently and said that it did introduce the idea of representation into the group, but I think he was just being kind to me. But at any rate, so I thought that I would say something about this trajectory so that it might, I can make a statement for myself. Now, let me begin with the idea of the subaltern and the popular. In my estimation, the idea, and this is not far from some stuff that I've heard today, I'm happy about that. It's not very unusual what I'm going to say. In my estimation, the word subaltern and the idea of the popular do not inhabit a continuous space at all. I see subalternity as a position without identity. Well, it's somewhat like the strict understanding of class, which is why it's a bit strange when clearly upwardly mobile academics, you know, sometimes with graying ponytails and guts falling over their blue jeans, will come up and say, celebrate their working class origins. What is that? That's not what, strictly speaking, class formation is. Subalternity, to an extent, is that kind kind of a thing. No one can say, I am a subaltern in whatever language. Or so to that extent, and I think the relationship, I don't want to just go on talking about this, so I'll just make a little analogy and move on to the body of the talk. I think the relationship between the subaltern and the popular may well be somewhat like the relationship between class and poverty, or race and color, or gender and sex, that kind of structuring, yes? So to my mind then, subalternity remains something that you don't establish again and again by recounting in a certain sort of positivist historical way the details of the practice of disenfranchised groups. That's one of my things. And then I would also say that I did not really come to the subaltern from Gramsci. I read Gramsci separately. I gave the essay, the paper, Can the Subaltern Speak?, under the title Power and Desire in 1983, 21 years ago. A year before I had read Ranajit Guha's very powerful essay on some aspects of the historiography of colonial India. When I revised, I retitled the text and I quoted that wonderful description from the essay where I talked about the fact that the subaltern and people, exchangeable words at that point in that essay, was the name of a differential space. I liked that. I was a young deconstructive, well, not that young actually, but youngish deconstructivist. I liked this notion of, I was taken by it. I hadn't met the man yet, and I had not and when I gave the speech, okay. Now, when I look back, I did indeed look back because there has been a bit of a wonderful feminist brouhaha about Can the Subaltern Speak? I like that, especially since its 20th anniversary coincides with the 20th anniversary of the admission of women into Columbia College. So good. Okay, so I've been looking at the essay a bit more, and what I have noticed is that whatever I wrote at the time of revision, I was already using the more specific sense of without access to the lines of social mobility in the piece, Can the Subaltern Speak? Subaltern in the sense of without access to the lines of social mobility, rather than the name of a difference. And the example was a woman. That was Can the Subaltern Speak? What remained, however, in place was the designation of subaltern studies as questioning colonial, nationalist, as well as Marxist historiography. Subalternity, therefore, for me, has also always been, I gave you the first sense, in binary opposition to the nation state, as it is now to the so-called international civil society, which Shell mentioned. For me, there are no subaltern nations, to quote Hart and Negri, and the subalternism, to quote my dear friend Homi, the subalternism of the contemporary NGO culture and world governance enthusiasts is a recoding and re-territorialization of the US doctrine of manifest destiny. So that particular sense of the subaltern as in binary opposition to those things, that has remained. Now, I should say now, as people know, this is not a secret, but I think it's worth talking about this so that the difference in the trajectory becomes clear, so that people don't say, this I forgot to say, there are also people who kind of love me, who decide to say, as Valerie Ritter just said in Chicago, that I was a founding member of the Subaltern Studies Collective. Someone said, apparently Dipesh told me in Melbourne, while Ranjita was standing in the audience, some woman asked him, have you heard of Gayatri Spivak and the Subaltern Studies Group? So this is also really extremely, I mean, it's not my fault if people should do this. It's for comparable reasons that my husband's left me. Public recognition, you can't do anything. You can't, this is a predicament. I mean, you can't go and tell each member of the public, don't talk nonsense, And given the patriarchal nature of the world, that means a lonely life. Anyway, to come back to And this is my situation also with the subaltern studies stuff. Anyway, to come back, it's a story which is a slightly different story, yes? The story was, and I've told this before, so it's nothing private. The story was that in '81, I was asked to write as a specialist on deconstruction by Yale French Studies and also by critical inquiry. Imagine how the times have changed. But at that point, for some reason, I thought, and I don't know the reason, I wouldn't think so this way now, I thought, well, how is it that I have just become a specialist in French theory? And then I turned to my own class. Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri, the woman in Can the Subaltern Speak, was my grandmother's sister. Yeah? And I never wrote that in Can the Subaltern Speak because I knew that, you know, I'm a theoretical person. I knew that if I said so, then I would get a lot of enthusiasm from my readers saying, oh, isn't Gayatri Spivak wonderful, her grandmother's sister, and so on. So I never, also my mother was a bit worried about this. My mother said, you're going to use her name. I said, Ma, you'll see, nobody will pay any attention to it. And as Howie Winant knows, and he's smiling away, I got many, 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 many hostile and negative responses as having silenced the subaltern, except for one in the pages of Socialist Review, Can the Subaltern Vote, which was a wonderful piece coming from Nicaragua. But at any rate, so therefore, I did not mention it, but I turned to my own class, the Bengali middle class. So on the one hand, Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri, and on the other hand, Mahashweta Devi. Absolutely, the class from which I came. From French theory, that's all I could do. But I did not remain there. The problems that emerged out of Can the Subaltern Speak were A, the problem of subjectship and agency, and B, the call to build infrastructure in the colloquial, not the Marxist sense, so that agency would emerge. See, I saw this woman. See, also in that essay has even been read, and I've heard Drew Cornell say this in public, as Gayatri Spivak. You see, this will connect to the accusation for feeding religious nationalism. I don't know if I will be able to come to a proper end where I can say that Meera Nanda's sort of absurd book suggests that the Hindu right is reading Gayatri Spivak, and as I said to Shudipto here, Terry Eagleton can't understand Gayatri Spivak, but the Hindu right not only is reading Gayatri Spivak, but understanding her so that they can actually, you know, do Vedic science. There are no footnotes ever given by Ms. Nanda. But nonetheless, in this particular context, I have heard people say that I propose sati as resistance against the British. I think anybody who actually has read the piece will see that I say again and again that the abolition of sati was an unquestioned good. The piece is as critical of the Hindus as it is really not critical of the British reform. All that it is trying to say is that since subject formation was not, woman's subject formation was not touched by this reform, it could not last. And this particular conviction is with me still, okay? And what I suggested was that this woman, who, in fact, by waiting for menstruation, was against, protesting against contemporary gendering, by waiting for menstruation was in some ways also moving against sati, because remember, sati menstruation was a dirty secret. You could not become a sati if you were menstruating, etc. And this woman who was living the problem with pacifism that we live today between ethics and politics in the situation of Palestine. I would like to be a pacifist. Israel doesn't allow me to be that. And to an extent, Palestine's response does that's a thing. Here was this woman who, in fact, not able to kill in the assassination program, did in fact kill herself. So there was that. And then finally, what there was the way in which women in the family were unable to read that as resistance at all. And the person, in fact, who could not read this was someone who was exactly my education. And in fact, I will say something about myself, which is slightly boastful. It's a long time ago. But in 1959, I came first class first in English at University of Calcutta. In 1957, from the same house, this first cousin came first class first in philosophy. That was the person who was unable to understand what the subalterns, what this woman's gesture meant. So this was the situation which made me feel that the building of infrastructure so that resistance could be recognized was a lesson. I saw agency as institutional validation, whereas subject formation exceeds the borders of the intending subject, to put it brutally briefly. And I saw reproductive heteronormativity as the broadest global institution. Reproductive heteronormativity as the broadest global institution. Now, let me say that, as I said, to escape, I turned to my own class, but I have moved. How have I moved? In the middle class, this is Partho's insight. Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri was metaleptically substituting effective and effect for a cause, producing an idea of national liberation by her suicide. This is Partho's argument as to how an idea of national liberation was produced by so-called terrorist movements. A daring and Clytemnestra-like project for a woman. In the subsequent years, the gendered subaltern, for me, kept moving down the social strata. Class is not the exact word here, because we are speaking of an area beside capital logic. Relative autonomy does not apply here, first, because autonomy is a marked concept, and secondly, because in the commonplace agential sense, there is so little agential autonomy in gendered subalternity. My discussion of Maharshita Devi's Daulati the Bountiful in Outside in the Teaching Machine describes a literary representation of the female subaltern as holding up the rural economy. This then came to relate to homeworking, permanent casuals, more orthodox accounts of the Marxist analysis of the female laboring body as the agent of production. Now, before I move to the next stage in this trajectory, I would like to say that when I first gave the paper in 1983, before contact with the Subaltern Studies group, I had been teaching Marx for some years. And it was, in fact, the passage from very, very well known and misquoted by many, many important intellectuals, passage in the 18 Brumaire, where Marx is talking about class formation two ways, and then he says, they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. That passage it was that led me toward that notion of the recognition of agency, okay? It was not indeed, and so that was the way I came to the idea of this woman and her resistance not being recognized. Let me say now, as a comparativist, and you mentioned my recent book, that it is mistranslated in the best English translations, okay? In the best, the sentence before, in the best English translations, it is said, they are therefore the old independent, small peasant proprietors who had lost their classness because of the slow transition from feudalism to whatever. They were therefore incapable of asserting their class interest in their own name. Whereas in the German, it is, ihr Klasseninteresse im eigenen Namen geltend zu machen, to make their interest count. In other words, to have what they are saying be recognized as such. That was the problem which got lost in translation, as it were. It's not a question of asserting anything. It was a question of not being, it was not in the currency, the sign system, that idea of value, not value in the Marxian sense, but, you know, like passing, that kind of thing, geltend zu machen. So that was what really led me into it. But on the other hand, I then, and this is also different, I then turned from that particular project. I'll come back to it in today's context in terms of the straight as, perhaps, the straight as abstract structure and secularism as an impoverished abstraction that we must protect. So I'll come back to it. But at that point, I felt, of course, with this example and so on, and with the idea, Gramsci was then in the back of my mind, perhaps, I felt, as I have felt more and more, that there was a very large ethics-shaped hole in the Marxist project. And in fact, one of these days, if I have enough time, that book that's been brewing in me since 1978, The Possibility of Socialist Ethics, I will write, and then the thoughts of that period will perhaps appear. But this idea now is coming to the fore in another way, and the way is that the international civil society, the self-selected moral entrepreneurs who give people these days philanthropy without democracy at best, and intervene in the name of military intervention in the name of doing good at worst, that's not quite international civil society, but it's on a spectrum, they use the word ethics to cover over the absence of democratic structure quite regularly. So this whole thing of getting onto a trajectory after choosing women of my own class, because there was no other place I could go. I'm a trained Europeanist. I'm not a South Asianist. I'm not a historian. But I did not stay there. And now I want to talk a little bit about in the next stage, which is, again, not a secret, what I now call, in this kind of an audience, I will call fieldwork. Because then you can take a small example. In this kind of an audience, I can call it case studies, because you can take a small example so that people don't bother me with, oh, I know a million people who are doing that. Because, when you produce some field work, you don't say, I know many people who are also doing similar field work among, so I protect myself. I can speak about a small undertaking going on for 15 years without people not noticing what it is, okay? So, the subaltern, slowly as I have moved, my project has become more and more not to study the subaltern, always in the sense of cut off from lines of social mobility, but to learn, because I'm a literary person, to learn from them in order to be able to devise a philosophy of education that will develop what, for want of a better expression, since I don't write about this stuff, generalizable phrases don't come immediately. For want of a better phrase, I will call the habits of democratic behavior, or rituals of democratic behavior, or intuition of the public sphere. Now, to cut this short, since I want to say more, so that's where it's gone, okay? And these are not folks from the Bengali middle class. And not at all. In fact, I don't ever see Bengali middle class folks there. But at any rate, what this last idea, insertion into the public sphere, means, I cannot speak at length about this. But I will, because I want to go elsewhere as well. But I would like to say that in a word, in a sentence or two, I could describe it in this way. This seems to be difficult to grasp. But then I'm well known for not being able to make myself clear. So if you don't understand what I'm saying because I'm unnecessarily obscure, turgid, or abstract, those are my problems, and they are problems. Do ask, and I will explain at great length. I cannot speak of this at great length right now. This is what it means to me. It means to me making it possible to create the conditions of possibility for metonymizing oneself, for making of oneself even better, a synecdoche, a part of a whole, so that one can claim the idea of the state belonging to one, which is what a citizen to an extent is. The state is in the citizen's service. This is hopelessly idealistic, especially in a repressive state in the current era of globalization, where the state is more and more reconfigured as not the agent of redistribution, but the agent of repression. That's about all it has, even if in the original sense it was redistributive. So I am, in fact, talking about an idea. Because whatever the state is like, the idea of relating to the state as citizen, I'm a green card holder here, I don't relate to the state in this way here. But the idea of relating to the state by noticing that, especially in my country, I mean, it's so multilingual, so multicultural, so many-leveled, etc., that in order to think in Indian citizenship, unless you want to go through nationalism, fascism, you have to metonymize yourself, the part by which I am connected to that abstract whole so that I can claim. It's not even the right to metonymize oneself, but it's the possibility, because the right means nothing in this context. Now, this kind of work can only be a supplement to much more quick-fix problem-solving work, but if it isn't there, then the class apartheid in the world remains in place. This is the next stage of the work with the trajectory of the subaltern, not to study the subaltern, but to learn. I'm a humanities teacher. I'm not a historian or an anthropologist. Therefore, those doors are closed to me. So to learn from this, it's very interesting because it's a reading task. It's a reading task. Learn to learn from these collectivities enough so that I'm always told, if I use the metaphor of invisible mending, torn cultural fabric, and then you invisibly mend in that sense, that there is a Pakistani poet who has used the same metaphor, Rafu. Well, the problem is like the other one. I mean, how many people do you think have used many of the metaphors that I'm using in my, there's no copyright on metaphors. It is, to an extent, the setting to work of the logic of the metaphor that I'm talking about. I'm very happy that there are other folks who use this metaphor, and I would like to have a nice collection of such metaphors from all over the world on my 70th birthday, if I live that long. But on the other, because people who say this to me never send me any references or anything. But so that's the next stage, okay? Now, why am I interested in this? I will tell you why I'm interested in this. I'm just coming from a kind of somewhat boys' conference, the Boundary 2 conference, okay, where Donald Pease, my old friend, but certainly a boy, was giving a talk on what has happened to the US polity in the wake of 9/11. Marvelous talk, and he's a very smart guy indeed. Now, in fact, I stole that Manifest Destiny stuff from him. But anyway, now, he got very excited, and he kept saying, I mean, anybody here who has seen Donald Pease knows how excitable he is. I mean, he screams away red-faced, somewhat like me. But he was saying again and again, what has happened is that the will of the citizen has been separated from the state. There is a kind of subalternity because the part is no longer part of the whole. Now, he was saying, I mean, 2 days ago, in conversation with Judith Butler in New York, this metonym synecdoche, luckily there was a woman, Deepa Jani, who was in both of the audiences, and she had found it very difficult to understand because she was thinking, Gayatri Spivak first took away the right to speak from the subaltern, and now she's asking the subaltern to dismember itself and make a pada. So, you know, and I kept saying, look, I'm not stupid. I mean, I may be anything else, but I'm a cunning person. Do you think I would really say such a thing? Try to understand. So here was Donald Pease, who was suggesting, you know, he had also understood the idea of the subaltern in that way, and he was saying that what had happened with the withdrawal of civil liberties and so on and so forth was that the citizen was no longer part of that whole, and therefore, tarara. I had a whole rap on executive power, etc., which obviously would be completely beside the point, but it was, so that's why I'm interested in this, because here in the superpower, there was, 15 years ago, Bruce, his name is, isn't it? Bruce Ackerman, saying that we, the people in the United States polity, are not engaged on an ordinary day. It's only when there are these Supreme Court decisions and so on and so forth, popular mandates, that they become excited. And now Donald Pease was suggesting that even that has been changed, and his idea of what a citizen is came very close to mine, and he used the word subalternity. Now, what it was with Donald Pease was that he was not able to take this and see that although it was like this inside the nation state, the United States, he's an Americanist, This has, if anything, exacerbated the desire to do good abroad. So that, I mean, we need really to have someone write an 18 Brumaire of, I used to say, the Bolshevik revolution, but I think 9/11 will take its place there. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. But at any rate, there will be, and so to an extent, he was unable to see that there was a way in which this particular robbing of agency, as it were, had unleashed a much greater charge, and generally in the name of gender as alibi. There is not enough time. I will try to make an end soon, but in this context, I will argue, and I will stand behind it, that the problem of the 21st century is the gender line, from the bottom to the top. But that I can't talk about right now if I'm going to. But this I've come to understand through the trajectory following subalternity. The subaltern as we know today, the old subaltern, and I've just spoken a little bit about working with groups of this old subaltern, withdrawn from lines of social mobility in terms of a kind of educational enterprise that in a supplementary way tries to release the possibility of this self-abstraction, self-synecdoche, etc. Release the possibility. I'm not saying one can do it in the classroom tomorrow. But at any rate, that's a summary. But on the other hand, I've also written about the new subaltern. By infrastructure, I had earlier meant the effort to establish, implement, and monitor structures that allow subaltern resistance to be located and heard. In the interim years, what has happened is the subaltern has become greatly permeable. There is plenty of writing showing the fragmentary lexicalization. You know, lexicalization is, I always give that sentence, iskule jabar shomoy pencil tule niye post office theke phirte bus dhorlam, something like this. You know, the words iskule, you lexicalize it with the locative suffix from Bengali, to school, and then jabar shomoy post office theke, you know, you add the ablative word after post office. That's called lexicalization, right? You're lexicalizing Bengali, Creoling, whatever you call it. So in that sense, you know, one could go on like this. Pensilta, you know, you add the kind of definite article suffix after the word pencil, so on and so forth. This is called lexicalization. So we have plenty of writing showing the fragmentary lexicalization, you know, Arjuna Padurai, Hillis Miller, satellite dishes in Nepali villages and so on, showing the fragmentary lexicalization of generally US cultural idiom into the otherwise heterogeneous subaltern everyday all over the world. Plenty of stuff. You can always get it. It used to be colonial discourse, used to be you go to the India Office Library, you're bound to find something. And now this stuff is the same kind of stuff. I mean, I wish I could tell the story about my dad, but I'm going to lose it all if I do. Okay, so the subaltern is now permeable. But there is no permeability in the opposite direction, except through appropriations for pharmaceutical patenting and dumping. That is where the permanent effort at infrastructural involvement is called for. I mean, you go down crossing borders, and I could give you many international civil society examples, because I am not a huge activist, but I certainly am one. I don't like making that part of my theoretical writing, because I know real full-time activists. I remain committed to this high theory, which I love doing. But on the other, they don't think it's high theory, of course. They think it's very vulgar, but I'm just making a little contrast here. But at any rate, so you cross borders, but if you're coming up, it's policed frontiers. I mean, that's also a metaphor. At any rate, which no doubt many people have used. But at any rate, that is where the permanent effort at infrastructural involvement is called for, and it must be repeated that the organization of international conferences with exceptionalist tokenization to represent collective subaltern will is a bad faith solution for both sides, if at all. This must, of course, be distinguished from the desperate and hardly perceptible effort at faking subaltern collective initiative by the leaders of counter-globalist resistances. I have called it feudality without feudalism. I don't think it's a good idea at this point to take a real position against it, because I know where the desperation comes from. And here, what kind of time have I? Plenty of time? Okay, another 2 hours. No, I will drop. No, here, therefore, I would like to talk to you very briefly about the new subaltern, because I am just coming from the first academic colloquium on indigenous knowledge systems in South Africa. Okay? Now, what is happening there? I'm not going to talk about everything, because there too, unworthily, I was asked to give a keynote. Or unworthily is wrongly used there. They didn't say that I would do it in freshman composition. Although I am unworthy, I was asked to give a keynote, okay? So hopefully, I have made the correction. Anyway, so to go back, I gave a keynote there, and I can't tell you everything that I said. But, you know, I was very moved by the fact that although I had done nothing in the area at all, and this was not at the great universities, not at University of Cape Town or Pietermaritzburg or Wits or any of those places, but a small place, and how it was that they had thought of me, so I went. But the real problem is that there is a competition with science. Okay, why do they call us pseudoscience? So there's anthropology, descriptive stuff. There is sociology, there's archaeology, and then there is this science stuff. Okay, so I spoke a little in a way that you will understand, although I will not expand. There were traditional healers in my audience. I'm not a religious person. I'm not immediately bowled away by traditional healers. But on the other hand, I do acknowledge, and again, I could talk a lot about, and if you ask me questions, I will, although I don't think one can generalize from the Kherias to the traditional healers in South Africa. That would be a great mistake. But on the other hand, the idea of knowing, the difference between knowing and learning, the difference between describing a card game well and teaching how to play the game, the difference between describing a card game well and playing well, the difference between describing the card game well and playing well enough to play to lose in order to teach. Those differences were the differences that I was thinking about as the traditional healers were sitting there. I was not able, obviously, I will not be able to talk now about why that led me into, once again, an emphasis on the need for detrivializing the humanities, because of course they're in a university situation. It's not like South Africa is going to remain in the traditional healer kind of thing, the museumization of traditional healers, maybe. But what was most interesting, and I spent most time on this, was the transformation of subalternity into property. Indigenous knowledge into intellectual property. Indigenous knowledge into intellectual property. The conversion of indigenous knowledge into data. Again, not something that one can turn one's back on. I talked a little bit about the importance of looking to see how the word sustainability was being used when such projects came by. To sustain what? We talked about that a little. But what was most interesting was that the work that's being done from within the group, the Indigenous Knowledge System groups, the work to, so the IIKSSA Trust, Indigenous Knowledge Systems of South Africa Trust, that is itself complicit with the idea that the transformation of indigenous knowledge systems into data is an unquestioned good, and that there need be no attention paid beyond the descriptive attention of anthropology and archaeology to what those systems are, and the only other arena was to say, this is as good as what you call science. I did talk a little bit about the Vedic science problem, and I did say, look, here, of course, there will be no religious violence in terms of this, and the problem with the Hindu right is not that it cares for Vedic science, it cares to prove that it is the best. But nonetheless, in that situation, it seems to me that the new subaltern is in a position which is altogether too permeable, and where the possibility of creating a general will for exploitation in the subaltern is altogether too present. And here, to a certain extent, the impatience of human rights intervention joins hands with what I have just described. Now, I need to make an end, so let me say that in this context, I have, in fact, a few pages on this, but I'm not going to read it. I'll just make 2 or 3 sentences, then if you want this, I can talk more about it. In this situation, I do have these 2 ideas about how we must nurture the abstract, okay? Looking at, you see, rather than make a liberation theology of reason, which Marx, the organic intellectual of the European Enlightenment, did do, the public use of reason from below, rather than go only with that, to recognize by looking, so that Marx would say that the commodity has a fetish character. It wears a hieroglyph on its forehead. You read it, and Marx knew Hegel, what happens is the Eucharist, of course. You transcendentalize it into reason. Not God, not any of that, but reason. And by the use of reason, the worker can, in fact, recognize that he or she is the agent of production through homeopathy, acknowledging that the abstracting of labor power was something that they could use, poison, as medicine, in moving toward socialism. But so that, once again, the idea that you, just as you voluntarily do the metonymizing to access the public sphere, it's not a loss of self. The ethical sameness cannot be compromised. It's not a loss of self. One has to be in a position where that subject-agent shift is possible. That's the idea of education in the humanities. That was Marx's idea, that you have, I mean, who will educate the educators, remember thesis. And so the idea that the worker should be able to see that that commodity, abstract labor power, if used with, rather than some kind of sob story, it's alienating me, etc., it can be used, but it didn't work, of course. I can't come into that now because I have to move on to the final point. But that notion that there is that kind of homeopathy of self-abstraction, that notion, if you take it in with all this subaltern studies stuff that I've been saying somewhat incoherently because I didn't have time to prepare a proper written text, then you can begin to see that reason is not, in fact, reason is not, in fact, our master, but the singularity of reason is not something that we should just ignore by saying that there are many different kinds of reasons. The reason is something, the logicality of that structure, which is abstract, is contained, in fact, within all kinds of cultural production which acknowledges alterity, which acknowledges otherness. Because of the fetishization of reason as master, we should not think that logic belongs to Europe at all, or Europe alone. One has to wait a little and work a little with people to see that that bottom line structuring is, in fact, contained within. I'll give you an example. I think by 4:30 I should end. I mean, that's enough. I'll give you an example. The people I work with are incredible weather predictors. I mean, clearly, they're not on television and they're not doing the whole world, but they're reading the signs in such a way that it's just amazing how they can predict weather. You know, to like a day for sure, and timing even, okay? On the other hand, so they know what causes this in that kind of learning rather than knowing way. On the other hand, if on the day that I come, there is rain after drought, I'm not saying mythological history is wonderful or anything. I'm just talking about the possibility of a kind of subtlety that we deny such people. On the day that I come, if there is rain after drought, they will say, you brought rain, and they will incorporate it into a song, and it will become part of a kind of record, but no one will mistake it for the kind of reason that is used when predictions are made. We are somehow not capable of allowing this kind of subtlety or suppleness in minds that have not been marked by European institutional learning. So therefore, even when we go against them, you know, against European institutional learning. So therefore, I would want to suggest that the secularism, to take it away from, secularism is not an episteme. In fact, the two 18th century ideas that served us so well, the separation of church and state, and also the privatization of religion, that served us so well, in fact, when class systems were in place, are not working for this violent world today. That doesn't mean we throw secularism away. That means that we do not mistake secularism for an episteme. Secularism is an impoverished, abstract system that must be protected as such. Teaching tolerance is not secularism. Teaching tolerance is good, but there are many, don't teach intolerance, but there are many, many examples which would show that you cannot tolerate without detranscendentalizing the religion within which you stand. Everything else is detranscendentalized and tolerated. So, and in fact, this particular feeling is something, because the person who doesn't at all believe in religion as a system of belief, which is me, is not necessarily tolerant. Nothing matters. So what would you be tolerant of? That it's a non-problem. So to that, you're respectful of cultural systems, etc., because it's a good thing to be, and you like literature, you treasure the imagination and imaginative constructs, but on the other hand, it's not tolerance that you, and I'm not taking myself as an example. In fact, the privatization of religion works fine for me. The separation of church and state works fine for me, because I'm a certain kind of class product. But to think that it is by imposing what works for me that I'm going to win a secular world, I think I would be completely blind. So in that context, the idea of producing a possibility where secularism is protected as small r reason as our ally, within, again, the agent-subject problem, within a much richer and much thicker acknowledgement of the imagination, that suppleness and shift. Number one, that, I'm sorry that I can't expand on this now, but I'll be happy to. And I bring in Kant here, which I won't do now. Some of you may have heard me at the MLA. I won't do now because it's complicated. But I will say this, that I go to Kant not because I think modernity began in the Enlightenment. I go to Kant because Kant's sense of the public sphere is not based on a separation of public and private. And also, here, in his very late work, he actually saw that some detranscendentalization had to take place in order for a real secularism to work, and he actually made grace itself into the effect of an effect. I cannot go there. Kant had problems. He thought Christianity was the best religion, although he tried to be very tolerant, and that's the problem with being tolerant. Christianity was the best religion historically as well as in its message, and that the best world would be patriarchal. Those are mistakes. But nonetheless, I can talk about Kant here a little, which I won't. So that's one thing. On the other side is the state. And here, in fact, to try to preserve persistently, this will take a very, very long time and will never succeed. But one must continue, as I say, like brushing one's teeth, even though one knows one is going to die. Toothbrushing as a critique of mortality. On that level, on that level, the state as an abstract structure of redress separated from the threat of nationalism and fascism, especially in a divided world in the global south, but now perhaps everywhere. This idea to preserve it as an abstract structure, I'm here joined by people as diverse as Carlos Monsiváis in Mexico and Rajeshwari Sundararajan, who is much closer to me, dealing with. We would rather have a relationship with a rogue state than no relationship at all. I'll close with this anecdote and a summary of what I have said, and then I'll welcome your questions. At a human rights dinner, because I hang out with human rights folks, someone who had heard about these schools of mine in Adivasi areas, my field work for the last 15 years, came up to me and began lavish complimenting. I find this extremely boring. So I would like to be complimented for my books and stuff. They never do that. Suddenly they find out there's a way that Gayatri Spivak can be complimented. Catherine Stimpson at the NYU event says, Gayatri, we know your moral work in India. I said, what your moral work? I'm just as moral in my teaching here at the Columbia classroom. Why do you think you've never been there? Why do you think only that is moral? Anyway, to forget it. So this person says to me, oh, Gayatri, what wonderful work you do. And I gave her the answer that I usually give. I said, yes, it's very nice, but you know, I'm an old socialist. I'm against private sector voluntarism, and that's what I'm doing. On the other hand, you know, when I try to share some of this with the education ministries, both in my state and in the country, the kinds of resistance that I meet with are extremely interesting, etc. So she says, yes, you know, I find this in my work as well. We are doing all of these human rights thingies in India, and on the other hand, you see, the state is just so recalcitrant to take all of this up there, because after all, the state is not accountable. So I went to I called Romila Thapar after I came back. And I said, Romila, you know, Romila was at the Library of Congress, so the time was okay. I said, Romila, look at what has happened. In the old days, we used to think that through the democratic processes, etc., however dreadful the state it was that was accountable to us. The state is accountable to the citizen. But look what has happened. It's come full circle. And well-meaning human rights enthusiast sympathizes with me by saying, of course, one can't do anything with states. The state has no accountability. And we spent some time talking about how it is that it has come to this. So therefore, I mean, I'll just keep it there. Therefore, the idea of reinventing the state as an abstract structure of redress, especially if Brazil, China, and India join, it will become, and if, as Japan is now asking, if they enter the group of 8, we will have a kind of purchase for working with this, which would be somewhat different from working from the receiving end of the group of 77. So these are the two things that I would say in terms of the new subaltern, not the old subaltern, I've spoken about that before, which can be programs. Now, within this context, the idea of the popular, which is where I began, will come and go. There are moments when it will touch popular movements, popular alliances, popular culture, popular literature, claimed, as Gautam so correctly said, claimed from the top, claimed from below, and so on. This will come and go, but I do not see that the popular can, in fact, be laid out, the specificity of the popular can be laid out in this abstract trajectory that I have tried to describe, trying to remove oneself from the sanctioned ignorance of French theory at ease when it is talking to itself, showing the problems that it will not show when it is writing like a philosopher, trying to move away from it, connecting to one's own class, the Bengali middle class. A year later, finding in Ranajit Guha's early work a way of restating this particular problematic that connected me to the subaltern studies folks in a loose bond, and then the move away from my own class, the Bengali middle class, and the turn away from studying the subaltern to learning to learn from below in order now to think about the possibility of self-abstraction, the homeopathy of self-abstraction, that is the insertion into the public sphere. Then coming to recognize through other kinds of contact with the old global social movements, the new subaltern. Then only very recently studying indigenous knowledge systems, some in response to the call from South Africa to see that the new subaltern also has to access the idea of transformation of indigenous knowledge into data, the engagement with TRIPS and TRIMS, and then coming in a very, acknowledging that it is possible that the work that we do can lead to, this is, if you like, the deconstructive politics of reading in ear of the other. Derrida talking about Nietzsche. Do not excuse Nietzsche from use by the Nazis, saying it was wrong. There was something there. Do not accuse Nietzsche of having been used by the Nazis and throw him away. Enter the protocol of his text and turn him around and use him. So to that extent, it seems to me that last bit that I was talking about, I'm not saying everybody, wonderfully careful essay by Shumit Sarkar, Mirananda can be dismissed some, but nonetheless, that everybody who makes that connection is necessarily wrong. No. Let us not accuse ourselves, but let us not excuse ourselves. That's where those last two things come from. We must make place for logic as not just the property of Europe. We must make place to see how it is held within other kinds of thick and rich knowledge systems and protect secularism and the state. Imagine and invent a secularism taken away from the history of the seculum and the imperium as it was under the Catholics, and then the seculum and the ecclesia. Take it away from that narrative, but preserve its abstract outlines beyond the, try to find in every polity, it's a language learning, I'm a comparativist, so not just some synonym for secularism, dharma nirapekha, what the hell does it mean? But look at words like, you know, the two systems that I can think of in my country, Din aur Duniya on the one hand, Paramarthik Jagotik on the other hand, the two main ones, right? So there's Jagotik, and in the Din aur Duniya stuff, which is together Al-Din, Al-Duniya, which is together in the one sentence in the Quran which uses the word Islam, to bring these two words together in that context. And in our Hindu context, I'm not a Hindu, but the words are there. The division between Jagotik and Paramarthik, if you want to be philosophical, look that way. Don't just make some kind of change from asampradayikata to dharmanirapekshata, etc. So that's that way madness lies. So therefore, the final thing, to learn to protect a reason that must be our ally in a world that is being put together more and more with the false promise of level playing fields, but deeply divided by class apartheid, to protect reason as our ally contained within other kinds of systems, to grant the subaltern the possibility of logic, and there the two things that one must protect is the abstract understanding of secularism and the abstract understanding of the state. Thank you for your patience.
I've brought my Hawaiian shirt and my blue jeans, and I left my ponytail at home, but I do have the stomach hanging over here, and I'm just absolutely delighted that you've seen the light and become a historian of science, as you mentioned from your account from South Africa. I need to ask you, though, about this concept of the new subaltern, because as a historian, and I'm sorry I cannot depass my disciplinary bounds at this moment, it seems to me that there are ways that people speak other than with words. And if we were to look to the semi-mature colonial apparatus in India around the turn of the 20th century, we might find an immigrant Jew by the name of Valdemar Haffkine, who was going about on the trains vaccinating people for cholera. An informant told him that he should not be cultivating his vaccines in animal products, and he switched from animal product to cultivating the vaccines in plant product out of what he said were religious sensibilities. So it seems to me, and although you may have been talking about this new subaltern as a category, that on the arrow of historical time, we find instances of perhaps a new subaltern or a permeability quite early in Indian colonial history.
Thank you. I wouldn't disagree at all. I'm talking about a tendency. I mean, no one can disagree that this business about the business of patenting, including DNA patenting, including under TRIMS, indigenous folks being fined for not having patented this stuff, etc. And that's now a big deal. I mean, that's all I'm saying. I mean, I'm very proud of a former student of mine, Shakil Bhatti, who's a program director now of the World Intellectual Property Organization in Geneva. And if you sit down with him and look at the map of the world, you see that this has become, I'm completely sure that what you're talking about is not, I mean, in fact, I'm not a historian of science. My brother is quite good, actually, historian of, especially medicine, and he does talk about these kinds of examples. I think you're absolutely right. And as for subaltern speaking in other than words, that was the business about can the subaltern speak. She'd hanged herself rather than, you know, be speaking, so.
Mark, can you get that?
I enjoyed your talk quite a bit, and I just wanted to ask a question about the dichotomies that you were deploying. And in particular, it strikes me that using the idea of indigeneity on the one hand and European on the other hand is perhaps problematic and may undermine the broader project with which you're engaged. I mean, for instance, Francis Bacon was indigenous to somewhere. He was indigenous to England, and when he wrote from the subaltern position. I mean, he was challenging religion, and he was challenging a certain approach to logic and Aristotelian empiricism with which he was engaged. So I guess what I'm curious about is whether you would be interested in trying to move away from that kind of dichotomy and acknowledging not just the kinds of splits within so-called indigenous cultures, but also the tensions and permutations and flexibilities in so-called Western culture as well. I guess I take issue with your point that Western cultures don't have that. In Germany, for instance, there's a book that's very wonderful called Sicher in Kreuzberg. It's in English, and it's about Turkish hip-hop in Germany, but it's not this kind of essentialist story about a different culture. It's a story about how the German state sets up cultural institutions. And there's many other examples of that. This book is by Ayhan Kaya from Turkey. And I'm just wondering if, I guess I feel a little bit of a feeling of ressentiment in coming up with the categories in that way, and wondering what you think about not relying on these ideas of purity, which I know, being a cunning person, and that you don't really see, and maybe you could respond to that.
Yes, I agree that one should not have a category like European versus indigenous. In fact, I like opera. I don't go to, no, I really do. I don't go to the Metropolitan Opera in New York because they've transformed opera into high culture, whereas if you go to the New York State Opera, you can see that that's European indigenous theater, because it's a small, I completely take your point. But on the other hand, you will never have perfectly undone binary oppositions. You will never have. It's when you use the binary opposition in a politicized situation, in a context. I wouldn't use the word context if I were among my schoolmates. I would use the word text. And in fact, the text in terms of textile, right? And so this is, everybody who reads the essay Différence thinks that the essay is about postponing things. But in fact, there is a sentence here, and sentence there in the English translation, page 17, left-hand side top, you'll see, which David Allison translated context, but Alan Bass knew enough, second translation, it is translated as text, where Derrida says that the desire to universalize, to transgress by universalizing, because generalizing is not the same thing, can be halted if one always keeps in mind the trace of the text. So I was speaking from within the trace of a historical text by which people have suffered. In fact, this is the reason I agree with you more than you can think. This is why I told the story of Catherine Stimson. I teach at two ends of the spectrum, all right? I teach and train teachers in those areas where there's no electricity, no running water, no toilets, no stores, no doors and windows, all that stuff, carefully. And I also teach English, not South Asia. I teach English to PhD students at Columbia University in the state of New York, two ends of the spectrum. And at first, when I began the work, the field work, I had thought that a dollar income is good. I won't work for an NGO. I'm an intellectual. I want to remain free to do this kind of free, whatever that word means. It's like the freeing of labor by capitalism. But I mean, there was the body, this is the head. But at any rate, so what I want is freedom to devise this philosophy of education. That's how, and I would say to my students, I would say, look, I don't love you anymore. I'm just earning my living so I can work elsewhere. That was 10, 15 years ago. And so I would say, look, I was brought up by bourgeois parents so that because I don't love you, I'm working even harder because you're paying me a salary. Get your money's worth. Work hard, I would say. But slowly, I began to realize that this kind of work is actually needs to be done at both ends. At both ends, the uncoercive rearrangement of desires, which is humanities teaching as such, very scary, because when teaching becomes kind of good, it becomes coercive, even benevolently so. I mean, if you look at the old Socratic model, look at what he did to those guys. I mean, it's total coercion. So it's very scary. It happens in spite of oneself, but that's the responsibility of the teacher, but at both ends. In other words, you don't make a distinction like that. And day before yesterday, I was questioning exactly that to Bruce Robbins, you know, the Western consumer and the third world producer. I said, what are you talking about? This is the way you folks make connections with folks in the third world, if you want to use that word, that you don't even know what their own status is, you know, the kinds of affiliations that are made post-Seattle and post-Genoa. So I completely take your point, but you cannot advance any kind of argument without making these divisions. And in this sense, I need someone like you to give the postscript that will allow me to say it is within the trace of this context or this text that I am speaking in this way, and I have allowed my friend Immanuel Kant, who was not nice to the Aboriginals, to enter into the indigenous camp, because from the bosom of the 18th century, he can provide something which I find useful. Thank you.
Gayatri, following the question of the state, and your wonderful phrase that you mentioned, that also you share with Carlos Monsiváis, which is better to be related to a rogue state and have no relationship at all. Is that what basically?
Yes.
Which is in a sense the whole issue of the metonymizing, you know, that you are asking us to reflect on and to reinvent the state through the process of metonymizing. Now, I mean, I will give you a very concrete example of a situation, I mean, of collectivities, you know, because you're asking, definitely thinking in terms of collectivities rather than individuals in being part or not part of the state. But for instance, I'm thinking of a situation that emerged in the context of Chiapas, of the Zapatistas, in the sense that the work all along was to be part of a rogue state until it became a situation in which the state had as its dictate to suppress, to not let them be part of that rogue state. So the new form that emerges, it seems to me, it reminds me of the Paris Commune, you know, of the Soviets, of the formation of autonomous regions, in spite of the state. What would your advice be?
Advice. Listen, I don't know anything about anything.
Or your thoughts.
I'll just say what I can. I'm a literary critic. In the situation of the Zapatistas, It seems I'm obliged to give you Ho Chi Minh's answer when he was asked about the consequences of the French Revolution. I don't know anything, but I can quote. He said, he gave a highly philosophical answer. He said, it's too soon to tell. Short and extremely thought-provoking. I think the project of thinking or reinventing the state as an abstract structure, which will make the division in the world. You know, then Shumit Sarkar, in fact, in that critical essay, says something very interesting about secularism and democratic structures, talking about Hitler and company. I mean, how does one understand secularism? Today, we have to compute the difference between Aristide and Saddam Hussein, secular polities. But we have to make the difference between the two, you know, so that it seems to me that we have not come to yet. Another thing that I would think about is we mustn't, you know, Mexico is after all the next state. It's not just Mexico. It's also, I mean, we are here in Santa Barbara. It's also not, I think, completely possible to see in that a model. Just, I think Antonio Negri, for example, making a model for the world's behavior from the Mirafiori riots, made that sort of a move, which was well meant, but I think it was not a correct generalization. So I would say with great humility that the way one turns May 1968 into a museum piece, the Naxalbari movement into a museum piece, I don't want that to happen to the Zapatistas, because they are coming Zapatista. They're coming as an example too often. My friend Jean Franco gave a wonderful response to this 20th anniversary of Can the Subaltern Speak? But fortunately, since she and I are neighbors, she telephoned me the night before and said, look, I'm going to make this suggestion that not everybody has to go through this kind of education, etc. I said, of course, you're right. Whoever said so? It doesn't travel. Theory travels, but this kind of stuff doesn't travel. So therefore, we talked it out, okay? But it does seem to me that it would be difficult to generalize from these examples. You know, when in fact I was giving the first version of this story, which was much more, this paper, which was much more Marx-oriented, Michael Hart was among my respondents. And he decided, although I had said, I mean, in this piece, there's hardly anything about the rural, right? But he decided that I was a Maoist because I spoke about the rural arena. And, you know, I said, look, Michael, China and India are both countries with extremely large rural populations. The rural poor are the largest sector of the electorate in India. I'm certainly not, I look with great respect upon those people who work with the urban subproletariat. I'm not, if that makes me a Maoist, I mean, you know. So, but then he says this. This is why there were so many Naxalites among the first subaltern studies group. And I looked at Amitav Kumar and I said, I ask you, Gautam, and I ask you, Gyan, who were the card-carrying Naxalites among the first subaltern studies group at Sussex? Names and addresses? You see the... Huh? Linkages is a different thing. Linkages is a very different thing. Who didn't have linkages? I mean, no, I didn't have linkages. Okay, yes, no, I understand. But what I'm trying to suggest is that this sort of Michael Hart calling me a Maoist, and by definition, then I left the country in 1961 with the Naxalites because the subaltern studies group were Naxalites. I don't think that's cool. You know what I mean? I could, of course, one can always find linkages. I mean, you know, Aniruddha Sen, who really did go underground, is my cousin. So I had a linkage, see? I mean, I don't know. So that's what I would say. I don't think we can generalize from these kinds of different cases. I think it's too soon to tell. I'm with these folks who want to do something, who want to make the state accountable. But I don't think we have a model yet. Or perhaps we never will, I don't know.
The first group of subaltern studies people being Naxalites is like them all being Brahmins as well.
There we go.
Which you hear all the time.
Or all Bengalis.
Right. All Bengalis too, including Shahid and myself.
Absolutely. Yes.
Gayatri, I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about one moment in the trajectory that you described, which I've heard you speak about before. I think it needs elaboration. This moment when you say you felt what was needed was not to study the subaltern, but to learn from. And I want to hear more about that. I'm intrigued by it. I've been puzzled by it in various ways. The intrigue grows because today, perhaps because some mediations are missing, it's followed very quickly by a suggestion about self-abstraction and entering the public sphere.
Yes, what a good question that is, Gyan. Now, one thing I must say, I don't want everyone to be like me. Okay, so Gyan, that's another thing. When I cannot say it is needed, but I will say it is also needed. I will say without it, things fall apart. That's what I'll say. So, I mean, as I make clear, I'm not an anthropologist. And there's nothing wrong with being an anthropologist or a historian. Disciplinary formations are things that train your mind to construct your object of knowledge in a certain way. You can break away from it, you can expand it, you can criticize it, but that really takes hold. My wonderful friend, Roald Hoffmann, who got a Nobel Prize in chemistry in 1981, but is a poet, all that stuff, and I once invited him to give a talk for cultural studies at Pittsburgh, and he and I are sitting in a huge audience, and Roald says to me very softly, he says, Gayatri, you see people, I see molecules. You know, so, you know, that's what I mean. So I don't want everybody to see molecules. But what I'm talking about is, I think the subaltern should be studied. I will not say no to description. And I will not say no, not just to description, but historically imaginative treatments and so on. Wonderful. But what I'm bent on, because I'm a humanities teacher, I am bent on the kind of teaching which is not just teaching resistance talk or teaching rights or teaching self-interest or doing literacy and numeracy as unquestionable goods by themselves. Now remember, no, you were not there, of course, at the Social Science Center when I gave my talk. I mean, when Amartya Sen did his Pratichi report, which of course it was the education folks from Vishwabharati who actually went around, but that in itself I think is a problem. You have to bring your time and skill because it's an enormous problem if you want to learn from below. But when they came around, they suggested that, this was a good suggestion, that private tuition was a bad idea. That in fact in the primary school system what was happening was that the teachers were not teaching anything and only those whose parents could afford to pay these teachers something, the teachers taught everything to them and they could take the exams. My problem of course is that even that kind of private tuition is in fact rote learning which keeps class apartheid intact. Forget it. But what I think is happening in this way of learning that I am trying to learn by, how am I trying to learn? By, like I said, it's like reading. You know, literary training teaches you to learn from the singular and the unverifiable. That's what Gautam and I were talking about. There is imagination in history. There is narrative in history. But the one difference is the history, testimony, imagination, what kind of claim to veridicality, yeah? So therefore, I can put all of that, suspend all of that training and put it to work by trying to learn from people, without romanticizing them, from people who are clearly not able to teach according to the veridical teaching model. It's extremely hard and I constantly make mistakes. Slowly the results come to me suddenly and unexpectedly, okay? This is learning to learn from below so that, and this is why your question is so good, because then I'm talking about the abstract. So that, and this is, I'm just here today, maybe in 2 or 3 years I will have rethought it. That's why I don't write about the stuff. It won't generalize yet. At least I'm now talking about it. But so that the possibility of seeing that the one that has rights, the legal awareness seminars come down and teach them rights and go away. And since there is no sense of the state, I told that story at the center of my teacher finally saying, Didi, ganatantra bujhi na, bhot dei. After I had really tried, because he had moved from CPM to BJP, right? So on that level, all those counts don't mean a damn thing. I asked him, since they obviously think that it's like two competing football clubs, etc., right? And so but I was appalled that my teacher had moved. So after class, I actually broke my own rule of not doing narrative teaching of that sort. So I asked him, do you know Karl Marx? Yeah. Alive or dead? He thinks for a little while. Dead, okay. So, heard of Soviet Russia? He says, yeah. So I say, now I try to first of all talk about programs. He has no idea. I said, okay, I'll go through this kind of story. I said, so where is it, Soviet Russia? By then, Soviet Russia was gone. But anyway, he says, he thinks. And he says, Uttar America, okay, North America. He was right to an extent. But anyway, so after this, I'm trying to explain to him what parliamentary democracy is, what vote means. This is my teacher, Devendra Panda. And then, after I've really tried and tried, he looks at me and he gives that, which means, sister, I don't understand democracy. I cast my vote. See, this is the thing. So in that kind of situation, the idea that casting the vote, the mathematization of oneself, it is also a body count. Unless accompanied by that possibility of self-abstraction. Listen, do you think the American public knows that? I mean, again, your question, why make a distinction? No, you don't make a distinction. You don't make a distinction. But I'm talking about these people, so I can't constantly talk about the United States. So therefore, coming back into this, the ability to self-abstract. And this is what puts it in line with that agent of production worker lesson. The ability to self-abstract in order to think the polity which will then be used by the agent. A very simple formula that you and I can think. You understand? Now, on the other hand, this ability will never be realized if this is all that is done. That's why I say everybody shouldn't be like me. But unless there is this, however much the problems are solved by it's like primary health care, you change people's habits of normality so that they behave in a certain way, plus clinics where you solve problems quickly. So it seems to me that that's the work, Jan, and it seems to me also that that's the connection between learning somehow the remnants of, because there is, like I say, in my estimation, I now go to China as well. I've been learning Chinese for some time. I go to these one-teacher schools. There is not something that tells us that logic is only European. That is one thing in these last 15 years that comes to me again and again. Except it is not God. And if you sense this, that does not mean you are a religious fundamentalist, whatever that word means. Because, in fact, you protect that, to repeat what I was saying at the end, by realizing that secularism is in the letter. It is an impoverished abstract system that we must protect. It is not a mindset. It is not possible. That's where the idea of the effect of grace in Kant is extremely moving. But that, I think, would be going too far. Have I answered you? Thank you. Is that it? There always comes this wonderful moment when one realizes that it is all done. Thank you so much for your patience and your questions.